Before we start with today's case, I'd like to issue a content warning. This video focuses on the murder and sexual assault of a small child. As these topics are extremely sensitive, I advise the viewer to proceed with caution. The residents of Helsinki woke up to a horrific piece of news on the 19th of March 1910. Yesterday morning, the body of a female child around 5 years old was found outside of Kaivopuisto on the sea ice. No visible signs of violence could be observed. The authorities are still investigating the matter. No one knew it at the time, but this short and modest news article informed the public of a heinous crime that, to this day, has never been officially solved. On the morning of the 16th, around 7 a.m., a fisherman spotted something on the sea ice just outside of eastern Kaivopuisto. When he approached, he realized quickly that it was the body of a small girl. She was laying on her stomach with her face in the snow and her arms stretched to her sides. She was completely cold and lifeless. Nothing could be done to save her anymore. The girl was wearing a blue coat and a short black fur collar. A dark brown hood with black ribbons to be tied under the wearer's chin was laying a few meters away. Other than her hat, she didn't seem to be missing any items of clothing. The girl's hair was tied in a short braid. She was estimated to be only around 5 to 6 years old. The authorities were immediately summoned to the scene, which, on the face of it, probably looked like a simple accident. The body was laying below a steep drop, with a gazebo right above it. Perhaps the girl had been playing near the gazebo, but fell because of the dark and slippery surroundings. The scene was photographed, and the authorities started looking around to get a better understanding of what had happened. The first thing they noticed was that the body had few, if any, signs of visible injuries. If she had fallen, she likely would have had some scrapes and bruises, or perhaps even some tearing on her clothes. But she didn't. This was the first sign that something else was going on. Next, the investigators noticed some cigarette butts close to the body. The obvious question was, did they belong to someone who had something to do with the little girl's death? Had someone lured her to the scene? To get an idea of where the girl and perhaps a second person had come from, the police brought sniffer dogs to the sea ice. Unfortunately, by the time the sniffer dogs arrived, the scent of the perpetrator could no longer be tracked. On top of that, any possible footprints had been trampled by all the people that had visited the scene, making footprint analysis impossible. Next, the girl was removed and transported to the coroner's office, though her autopsy couldn't be performed right away due to how cold and stiff she was. The temperatures in Helsinki were hovering around -1 to -2 Celsius. The good news was that her body was still in good condition for the examination. But before we move on to her autopsy, which happened 2 days after her discovery, we need to talk about who the little girl was. On Wednesday, the 16th of March, around 6 a.m., a frantic mother called Fanny Matilda Lindgren arrived at the police station to report her daughter as missing. Her only child, Hjördis, had gone out 12 hours ago at around 6 p.m. and never returned home. To her horror, she would find out only a few hours later that her daughter's body had been found. Hjördis Elviira LIndgren was born in 1904. She was a 5, almost 6-year-old girl and was the only daughter to her parents, Johan and Fanny. The family lived at the heart of Helsinki in an apartment on Ratakatu 13. Hjördis's father Johan was a horse carriage driver, a career which you could loosely compare to today's taxis. I couldn't find what Hjördis's mother did as a job. She may have been a housewife, but most working-class women did have to work in some capacity, so my assumption is that she did as well. Hjördis herself was too young to attend school yet, so she spent most of her days freely roaming and playing outside. She was not a timid child. Her parents described her as cheery and brave. She made friends easily with both children and adults. Based on their names, the family was Swedish-speaking, or at least capable of speaking Swedish. At this time, Finland was a Grand Duchy of Russia, but 100 years earlier had been part of the Swedish kingdom for centuries. As a result, many Finns, especially those living in cities, had Swedish ancestry and spoke the language. This is still the case today. All in all, the Lindgrens were a normal, though quite small, working-class family from this time period. So, what had happened on the night of the disappearance? On the evening of 15th of March 1910, Johan was working while Hjördis and her mom Fanny were at home. At around 6 p.m., Hjördis was feeling bored. She asked her mom if she could go to the library to look at some picture books. The library, located only 10 minutes away on Rickhardinkatu, was very familiar to Hjördis. In fact, she had visited the library earlier that very same day. At first, her mom wasn't enthusiastic about that idea. It was already getting late, and the weather was poor and slushy. But, on the other hand, Fanny was planning on cleaning around the apartment and thought it would be best if Hjördis was elsewhere during that time. Her daughter promised that she'd only look at one book and come home straight after that. Fanny relented, giving Hjördis permission to go. She dressed Hjördis in some warm winter clothes, and the girl walked outside in high spirits. Fanny would undoubtedly regret that decision for the rest of her life, because that was the last time she ever saw her daughter alive. Fanny cleaned the apartment, probably not noticing the passage of time. Around 8 p.m., someone was at the door. Perhaps she thought it was Hjördis, but her husband Johan greeted her instead. He had finished work for the day, and when he came in, he asked where his daughter was. Fanny explained the events I relayed to you before. Realizing how late it was, Fanny put her own winter clothes on and went outside to look for Hjördis. Maybe her daughter just lost track of time and stayed outside for longer than she had promised. Or maybe she had gotten lost and she was tired and cold somewhere. Regardless, Fanny, now quite worried, was frantically walking towards the library. She became more and more anxious as she didn't run into Hjördis on Korkeavuorenkatu, which is the street she would have taken to go and come back from the library. Fanny now faced an issue. She didn't actually know where the library was. We forget nowadays how easy it is to use Google Maps on our phone to find our way, but even just a few decades ago, people had to use physical maps. This poor mother paced around Ludviginkatu over and over, until she finally found the library on the street over. Unfortunately, the library had already closed. Hjördis couldn't be inside anymore, nor was she waiting anywhere nearby. Now, Fanny's strategy was going back home. Maybe they had just missed each other, and her daughter arrived at the apartment while she was gone. But she hadn't. Now the Lindgrens really feared the worst. They called all nearby police stations to inquire, but nothing came of this. Fanny checked the nearest movie theater where her daughter used to visit with other children, but didn't find Hjördis there either. She visited acquaintances, but they hadn't seen her. Fanny even visited the hospital just in case Hjördis had been in an accident, but nobody of her description had been admitted that evening. Fanny and Johan spent a restless night looking and waiting, trying to understand what could have happened. At 6 a.m., Fanny finally had no other option but to walk inside the police station to report her daughter, Hjördis, as missing. Kaivopuisto is one of Helsinki's oldest, biggest, and most well-known parks. It's located on the southernmost shore of the city. The western shore of Kaivopuisto had a beach and a bathhouse, whereas the eastern side had villas and further along a harbor. The area is quite accessible, though depending on the route you take to walk there are a lot of upward slopes. Kaivopuisto was a 15 to 20 minute walk away from the Lindgrens' home. While not impossible, it was still a relatively long and arduous walk for a 5-year-old to complete on their own, in unfavorable weather no less. The park wasn't completely unfamiliar to Hjördis, as she and her family had visited it in the previous summer. But to Johan and Fanny's knowledge, Hjördis hadn't been there since then. Hjördis tended to play closer to their home. The Lindgrens also didn't have any acquaintances in that area. Her parents thus concluded that either Hjördis had made her way to Kaivopuisto with other children who were more familiar with the area, or she was led there by an adult. On the 18th of March, Professor Ernst Järvenpää conducted Hjördis's autopsy. Järvenpää was the first ever professor of forensic medicine in Finland. He was undoubtedly the best at his craft in this time, and he went on to conduct autopsies in numerous well-known criminal cases after this. Hjördis Lindgren's body was photographed at the morgue, after which the autopsy could begin. During the examination, Järvenpää reported some light contusions on Hjördis's body, but where, how severe, and how many, I don't know. They must have been under the clothes because they were not detected when she was initially found. There were no broken bones or scratches. Hjördis's cause of death was drowning. There was water in her lungs, and her upper body was still wet when she was found. This meant that she had been deliberately drowned, confirming once and for all that this was a murder. The next, perhaps even more horrifying finding was that Hjördis had been raped before her death. The papers claimed that this had been done in such a cruel and disturbing way that they couldn't report the details, which I think is for the best. As a reminder, this poor girl was only 5 years old. In the early 1900s, police already had some invaluable forensic techniques, such as finger and footprinting, toxicology, blood spatter analysis, and to some extent even ballistics, which is forensic firearm examination. Unfortunately, in this case, the physical evidence was very minimal. Hjördis had few, if any, injuries, and she was found outside in the snow, where the elements are unpredictable and wash away evidence. A rape kit and DNA analysis could of course not be done, as this technology wouldn't come around for nearly a century. As I mentioned before, police had already utilized sniffer dogs at the crime scene, with no usable results. A good lead right off the bat were the cigarette butts found near her body, which I would assume were collected as evidence. The papers don't mention how many of them were found. So, at this point, the police were looking for a man who likely smoked cigarettes, may have been fluent in Swedish, and was familiar with Helsinki. It would have been hard for someone unfamiliar with the city to lure Hjördis to where she was found. The authorities asked the public for help in solving the case. They were looking for witnesses who may have seen Hjördis that night after she left home. To help in this endeavor, Finland's Women's Association promised a 500 mark reward to anyone who came forward to the police with information that led to the capture of Hjördis Lindgren's killer. 500 marks today would be more than 2,500 euros, or nearly $3,000. This would have been a life-changing amount to most, and no doubt motivated many to come forward. A few young boys approached the authorities stating that they had run into Hjördis that night right around 6 p.m. Whether they were already friends with her or not is not entirely clear, but regardless, the children played for a while, after which they went their separate ways around 7 p.m. on Yrjönkatu. Another witness, the Lindgrens' neighbor from Ratakatu 11, called Wiberg, also claims to have seen her that night. Wiberg knew the Lindberg family well. He was coming home from work when at around 7:30 p.m. he saw Hjördis leaning on the gutter at the corner of Ratakatu and Korkeavuorenkatu. She greeted him by saying, "Good day, uncle." When he asked what she was doing out so late, she explained that she was on her way to the library. He told her to come back home soon, and he went on his way. The librarian on duty that evening was asked if Hjördis had made it there on the 15th. She did recognize Hjördis based on her appearance, since the girl was a regular visitor, but she couldn't be sure if she had seen her that evening. The librarian did mention, however, that it was quite common to see unsavory characters visiting the library. The authorities came to the conclusion then that perhaps someone had lured her away from there. The next obvious thing to examine was Kaivopuisto and the surrounding neighborhood. At this time, before cell phones and cop cars, police had to patrol the city quite actively to prevent crime. Luckily enough, there were patrolling police officers in Kaivopuisto that day, but the officers signed to Eastern Kaivopuisto, Officer Suomalainen and Officer Wikner, claimed that they had not seen or heard anything suspicious. The only sighting they recalled from that night happened between 1 and 3 a.m., when two gentlemen walked towards the area from the city. One of the men entered his home in the Kaivopuisto neighborhood, while the other stayed outside. He explained that his friend went inside to fetch his dog so that they could drive out some meowing cats. The men walked around with the dog for 10 to 15 minutes, after which they went their separate ways. There was nothing notable or strange about this encounter, so the investigators moved on. It seemed that neither Hjördis or the perpetrator traveled through Kaivopuisto to get to where her body was. In terms of who could have had direct line of sight to the crime scene, there was one possibility. There's a small island on the coast called Luoto, which houses a restaurant. While during the winter the island was practically always empty, there was a lone guard on the island at the time of the murder. Upon questioning him, however, they were disappointed to find that he had seen nothing. Now, the most notable witness testimony from this area came from the shipyard's night watchman, Kustaa Olof Marja. The watchman claimed that around 11 p.m. on the 15th, he heard a little girl's screams coming from Eastern Kaivopuisto. The scream, which came around 1,000 meters or 0.6 miles away, sounded as if it was either moving away from him or sort of slowly quieted down and stopped entirely. Right around the same time, he also heard the sound of hooves. Marja concluded that someone was transporting a child on a horse carriage, but did wonder why they'd have to do so this late. He hypothesized that the child was sick or injured. 2 hours later, on the same shift, around 1 a.m., something else notable happened. Night watchman Marja saw a man frantically walking towards him from around 400 meters away on the ice. He was approaching from the direction of the screams, the very same place where Hjördis's body would also be found only a few hours later. The man stepped on the land onto the area Marja was responsible to guard, seemingly with the hopes of entering the gate and continuing into the city. He walked all the way to Marja before noticing him, flinching in surprise. He quickly asked in Swedish, "Är ni vakt här?" which means, "Are you the guard here?" which Marja replied yes to. The man then offered Marja an Armiro brand cigarette from a case which had 4 cigarettes left. The man asked for some light, and while Marja was lighting the cigarette, he got a closer look at his face. He was approximately 25 to 30 years old and average in size. He had a round, beautiful face, red cheeks, smooth skin, and a crooked nose. He had dark hair and a small, even black mustache without any beard. The man was wearing a black, knee-length jacket whose collar was upright. On his head he wore a bowler hat, on his neck a white scarf, and on his feet he had galoshes, which are a type of overshoe worn over regular shoes to protect them in rainy weather. Marja described the man he saw as a gentleman, not a lower-class working man. Indeed, based on his clothes and overall neat appearance, the man was upper class. Working men at the time generally wore much simpler shirts, jackets, and trousers. The fact that the man spoke Swedish also strengthens the idea that he was upper class. The men smoked and had a conversation, during which the gentleman explained that he had been walking in Kaivopuisto and was returning back to the city on the sea ice. He didn't explain why he chose to walk on the ice instead of choosing another route, but he did say the ice was quite weak that night. The man eventually finished his cigarette and went on his way, leaving Marja to complete his night watch shift. Now, you're likely thinking that the gentleman could have been one of the men that was walking the dog in Kaivopuisto, and I tend to agree. The man said he had been walking in Kaivopuisto, and Officer Suomalainen and Wikner said there weren't really any others in that area that night. The timelines seemed to match, and all the men, Marja and the officers, used the word gentleman, or herrasmies in Finnish. I'm inclined to believe that this sighting is not related to the murder for reasons I will talk about later, but some things are suspicious about it, and they are as follows. 1. Why did this man choose to walk on the sea ice, which he himself called weak, instead of choosing another, safer and more comfortable route? Could it be that he did not want to be seen? 2. Why was he spooked when he saw night watchman Marja? Was he doing something he should not have been? 3. The police were relatively certain that the perpetrator was a smoker because some cigarette butts were found at the crime scene. This gentleman smoked, and his cigarette case was not full. 4. The man spoke Swedish, which was likely Hjördis's first language as well. Hjördis may have trusted a Swedish speaker more than a Finnish speaker. 5. The gentleman did not come forward to the police and identify himself after this sighting was printed in the newspapers. Why? 6. Lastly, what are the odds that a mysterious man who looks like he doesn't want to be seen, comes from exactly the area that screams were heard from and a body was later found at, is not the killer? Despite all these questions, I'm not sure if the police were able to rule the men in Kaivopuisto out, or if they were compared to night watchman Marja's witness statement. This is of course frustrating because Marja's statement was taken extremely seriously, and the man's description was used to rule suspects in and out. Before we move on, I wanted to talk about just how much Hjördis Lindgren's murder impacted Helsinki and all of Finland. Pretty much all groups and associations gathered and talked about it. People theorized and tried to solve the murder on their own, and parents became more vigilant about children. Most importantly, it shone a light on something that went largely unreported and unrecognized before. Helsinki had a child predator problem. The amount of child sexual abuse cases I came across while doing research for this video is honestly staggering. Every time I thought I had seen it all, there were more. And what I find interesting is that the reporting on them skyrocketed after Hjördis's murder in March 1910. It's as if the public, the authorities, and the media started looking at this matter more closely. The sad reality is these crimes had been happening for a long time, on a large scale. It took a child's life for things to change, which is horribly tragic, but in a way brought justice to many other children. For minors, or anyone for that matter, to report a crime, they must know what happened to them was wrong or illegal to begin with. The newspapers condemning this behavior brought awareness. I wanted to preface this because I will now recount some crimes and potential suspects. In March, 2 girls were walking on the sea ice from mainland Helsinki to Lauttasaari. Suddenly, a young man attacked them. He started brutalizing one of the girls, who was thankfully able to free herself and escape back into the city for help. Unfortunately, the man was able to rape the younger, 14-year-old girl who was left behind. While the girl survived the attack, she had to be treated at the hospital for her injuries. The perpetrator was caught at the end of March when one of the girls was visiting a movie theater and recognized him there. This young man, who remained unidentified by the newspapers, was heavily suspected of Hjördis Lindgren's murder, but was seemingly ruled out by the authorities. On the 1st of April 1910, a 14-year-old girl called Lempi was visiting a store on Antinkatu 13. She was looking to buy a specific type of ribbon, which the shopkeeper, 30-year-old Victor Eloheimo, was helping her look for. When the pair couldn't find the ribbon, Victor started showing her other products while the two were having a casual conversation. When Victor saw that Lempi seemed interested in some belts, he offered to give her one of them for free. Now, Lempi became suspicious of the situation and wanted to leave. This is when the man started getting physical and even tried to drag her behind the counter. Lempi fought back and attempted to leave the store, but was unable to because Victor had locked the door. Thankfully, some passerbys heard her banging on the door and she was saved. Victor denied trying to assault Lempi and had all kinds of excuses for what had happened, but after a trial, he was found guilty for attempted rape and sent to prison for 2 years and 6 months. Victor Eloheimo was married with children. He died in Helsinki on the 19th of October 1924 at 44 years old and was buried at Malmi Cemetery. On the 5th of March 1910, a 37-year-old pharmacist, Johannes Nyman, was walking on Ursiinin Kallio, which is an area on the shore of west of Kaivopuisto. Johannes noticed two underage boys, who he approached and asked to come with him for a quick dip. It's a tradition both in Finland and Russia to take a dip into a hole in the ice for a cold bath, especially in between visiting the sauna. This is what Johannes was asking them to do, and the boys agreed. When the trio arrived at the nearby bathhouse, Johannes informed the boys that he had no intention of swimming and went on to sexually assault both of them. After he was finished, he gave each boy 25 pence and let them leave the bathhouse. After a few days, Johannes ran into one of the boys at the National Library and was able to lure him back to the bathhouse, where he repeated the same crime. It's unclear how he was finally caught, but his trial started a few weeks later in April. Johannes was sent to a psychological evaluation, where it was determined that he was developmentally delayed. He had received a blow to the head as a child and had been severely ill multiple times in his life. Johannes suffered from depression and had suicidal tendencies. In fact, he had attempted suicide before by jumping out of a window, but he was unsuccessful and only managed to injure his legs. Johannes started self-medicating with alcohol at age 16, but had since moved on to cocaine and morphine. Because of all these factors, Johannes was not deemed entirely responsible for his crimes and received a 3-month prison sentence. 8 years later, in January of 1918, just before the Finnish Civil War, Johannes Nyman took his own life by inhaling chlorine. He was 45 years old and unmarried. He was buried at Hietaniemi Cemetery. It was the evening of Tuesday, March 22nd, 1 week after the murder. A group of children, both boys and girls, were playing in Kaivopuisto as they often did. One of them, Harry, had his dog Barry out with him. The dog tugged him toward a narrow crevice in some nearby rocks, and Harry followed only to freeze when he saw something. Someone was hiding there, watching him. When the man realized that he had been spotted, he started hurrying away towards the bathhouse. Harry quickly told his friends about this strange encounter, and the children, all aware of Hjördis's murder, decided to search for the man in small groups. 2 of the girls were walking past a bush when the man suddenly tried to grab them. Thankfully, he was unsuccessful, as other people heard the commotion and came around. The man tried to escape again, but was caught by a Russian officer right outside of Kaivopuisto on Neitsytpolku. As the police came to the scene to arrest the man, Harry identified him to be the same person he had seen moments earlier in the crevice. At the police station, the man was identified as 33-year-old Karl Myllymäki. He had been married for 7 years and had 1 child. Obviously suspicious, the police asked what he had been doing in Kaivopuisto, and if he had anything to do with Hjördis Lindgren's murder. Karl stated that he actually did know something. According to him, just earlier the same evening around 7 p.m., he was visiting the police department to report that he had seen a man and a young girl in Kaivopuisto a week earlier, precisely on the night of the murder. He seemed to suspect that he had seen Hjördis and her killer. After filing this report, he decided to walk around Kaivopuisto. He said he did notice the children following him around, but denied doing anything inappropriate to them. This was obviously false, as the police knew for a fact he had just grabbed the 2 little girls walking past his hiding spot. Other than this, though, police didn't have any proof to suspect him of the murder or anything else untoward. If his story that he had seen Hjördis was true, he's the only witness to have seen the girl and her killer this close to the crime scene. It is, however, good to keep in mind that Karl may have concocted this story in order to distract from his own child predation in the area. Karl Myllymäki went on to get a 20-day prison sentence for trying to assault the girls in Kaivopuisto. He was ruled out as a suspect in Hjördis Lindgren's murder. On Saturday, 28th of August, a 12-year-old girl called Martha was in charge of letting clients into a public bathroom located on Pohjois-Esplanadin katu. The street gets its name from the esplanade located on it, which basically just means a green parkway. Back then, the street hosted a movie theater, restaurants, and other businesses. If you ever visit Helsinki during the summer, I highly recommend visiting it, as it's still there. The person officially in charge of guarding the toilet was Martha's mother, but she had her daughter help her with the job so that she could run other errands during the day. Martha was on duty at the entrance from 12 to 6. At around 4 p.m., Martha was conversing at the door with another girl, a 10-year-old called Hulda-Maria Lestinen, who was out selling picture postcards. Suddenly, a man approached the two girls. He looked like a proper and well-off man in his neat, light-colored suit and a round boater hat. The gentleman was hoping to enter one of the toilet stalls, but needed some change for his 50-pence coin. The fee for the automatic door was 10 pence. Martha went to get the man 40 pence from the cash register and opened a stall door for him all the way back in the hallway. Hulda stayed outside with her postcards while the man walked down the hallway. While still chatting with Martha, he entered the stall, leaving the door open. With no hesitation, he started opening his pants and Martha saw his genitals, which seemed to be purposeful on his part. This is when the man asked who the younger girl was that Martha had been talking to. She explained that it was a poor girl called Hulda who's selling postcards. The man then said he's interested in buying a postcard and beckoned Hulda to come to him. Hulda did as asked and walked all the way down the hallway and showed the man her cards. After briefly looking at them, he asked the girl to sit down on a bench right outside his stall and wait for him to finish his business. The man finally closed the stall door. Hulda sat down and Martha returned back to the main entrance. What happened next really creeped me out when I first read it. The man kept glancing around from behind the door every now and then, seemingly looking for the right opportunity. When there were no others near the stall, he suddenly emerged with his clothes in disarray and grabbed Hulda by the throat and arm. The girl couldn't even scream when she was dragged into the stall because of how hard he was squeezing her. Martha thankfully witnessed the whole thing and quickly ran out to get some help. A passerby called Karoliina Hietala and movie theater La Scala's doorman Jalmar Buscata came to the rescue, breaking the stall door. Hulda immediately ran out, scared and disoriented. Later on she said that the man had exposed himself to her and tried to assault her, but stopped the moment he heard sounds coming from outside. Upon opening the stall door, the man, frantic and partly unclothed, started begging the witnesses to not call the authorities. He claimed that he had no ill intent towards his victim and did not want to raise a scandal. He said he was willing to settle the matter any other way, which I assume meant he was willing to pay them off. Thankfully, the witnesses did not listen to his pleading and called for the authorities, who promptly arrested him. The man was identified as 42-year-old Karl Bergman. He was a highly educated, well-liked man who worked as a surveying engineer. He had a successful career, a lot of money, and great influence. Karl had previously been working in Viipuri, a city in southeast Finland, which was later lost to Russia in the Second World War. His permanent residence was still there, but he had recently received work in Helsinki. In the police interview, Karl explained the events of the day the same way Martha had up until the attack. The events after this were inconsistent, and he went on to change his story multiple times, trying to keep his guilt to an absolute minimum. He did stay consistent in the fact that he did not intend to harm the girl. He explained that he became anxious that someone might misunderstand his intentions if they were to see him talking to a girl in the bathroom hall, so he tried hiding her. Due to reasons completely mysterious to me, Karl Bergman was released while he waited for his trial. This caused public outrage, and even Helsinki Times openly criticized the police for this choice. The trial started in September of the same year. All 4 witnesses, including the victim Hulda Lestinen, were heard and told their stories consistently to each other. Karl Bergman, on the other hand, cried and tried his best to convince the court that he had no bad intentions. Karl's defense lawyer fought hard. He started painting Hulda and her family in a bad light, dismissed any evidence of her injuries, emphasized that no rape had occurred, and asserted that there was no actual evidence to back up any of the prosecution's claims. The court case kept getting dragged out until the decision was made on 23rd of November. Karl Bergman was not found guilty of attempted rape. The only thing the judge felt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt was an indecent exposure charge, which he was given a month of jail time for. Karl was also mandated to pay 20 marks of compensation to Hulda's father, as well as 8 marks of witness fees. After he had served his sentence, Karl Bergman returned to work in the city of Viipuri, probably hoping that everything could be swept under the rug. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. He went on to have a successful career for decades after what he had done. He was extremely well liked and highly regarded in his field, all the way until he retired in 1933. Now, while I'm not completely against theorizing within true crime, I do think it should be done with care and should be based on some sort of evidence. Wild accusations can really hurt a case and real people. But in this case, I can confidently say that Karl Bergman probably had a long history of sexual abuse against children, both before and after the crime I just detailed to you. 4 years earlier, while he was still working in Viipuri, Karl had made a similar attempt to sexually assault a young girl. He had gotten off the hook in that case too, just by saying that he wouldn't do it again, which we now know he did. When I tried looking for this case in the Viipuri newspapers, I couldn't find anything, which to me indicates just how much power he had. It seems to me that due to his privileged position in society, he was able to worm his way out of trouble whenever he committed his crimes. He likely paid for or scared his victims into silence. This is all my speculation, of course, and I have no proof of his misdeeds outside of what I've told you. But I think especially after everything that's happened in recent years, we all know how far influential rich people can go with no repercussions. To my knowledge, Karl was never officially named as a suspect in Hjördis Lindgren's murder. Even I myself don't know if he could have done it. But there was just something about him in particular I still wanted to highlight due to how icky and manipulative he was. Karl Bergman died at his home in Helsinki in 1936. He was 68 years old and had been sick for quite some time. His obituaries only focused on all his achievements, charity work and sacrifices, conveniently glossing over his unsavory past. One obituary even omitted his work in Helsinki altogether. Karl was buried in Hietaniemi Cemetery in an elaborate funeral, attended by his family, co-workers, and even some minor celebrities, such as organ player Paavo Raussi and opera singer Yrjö Ikonen, who both performed for the mourners. The last incident I wanted to discuss relates to an extremely important lead that the police received soon after the investigation started. Hjördis Lindgren's friend, a 12-year-old schoolgirl called Ines, came forward to tell them about an incident. Ines told the police that 2 days before the murder, on the 13th of March, she and Hjördis had been playing outside around Annankatu 3 with a group of other girls. Suddenly, one of the girls pointed out a man on the street and told the others, "There goes that man again who's been harassing us." The group of girls turned to look at the man standing in the intersection of Annankatu and Iso Robertinkatu. As they watched, the man started following a group of 4 Finnish-speaking girls. That's when Hjördis told the others that the same man had previously followed her as well. On the next day, on the 14th, Ines and Hjördis were returning home from the movie theater. When the girls had almost reached Hjördis's home on Ratakatu, the same man from the previous day approached them. He seemed to show extra interest in Hjördis. He showed her 25 pence and asked if she'd like to have the money, but she refused and ran inside to her parents. Ines continued to see the same man trying to lure other kids, even on the same day as the murder. As we know, Hjördis was usually trusting and prone to talking with strangers, which is why it's odd she was so scared of this man. Police now knew that not only were there a slew of child predators in the area, one had already tried targeting Hjördis. It didn't take long for the police to track down the man Ines described. 8 girls, all 9 to 10 years old, approached the authorities, telling them that a man had been harassing them near the old church. He tried to lure them to his home, which he told was in the neighborhood of Töölö, an estate called Rosavilla. Unlucky for him, now the police knew exactly where the man lived and went to arrest him. He was 52-year-old painter Adam Fritjof Granlund. Adam was married with 6 children, and he had previously been convicted twice for theft. He had a history of preying on children. One of his usual spots was the elementary school on Tehtaankatu, only a few blocks from Kaivopuisto, where Hjördis was found. Adam tried to lure kids with money and candy. He would try to expose himself to girls, and he attempted lifting girls' skirts up. It seems that he had never successfully raped one of his victims, but it was clear that this was the next step for a man like him. When Adam was asked what he had been doing on the 15th of March, he said that he had been home from 6 p.m. onwards and hadn't left the whole night. I assume that his wife and children were asked to corroborate this. He was shown the picture taken of Hjördis at the morgue, and he claimed he didn't recognize her and had never spoken to her. This police knew to be false based on Ines's testimony, but had no evidence, at least for the time being, that Adam was responsible for the murder. While waiting for Adam's harassment charges to go to court, he was let go. Now that he was back on the street, Adam actually left Helsinki and traveled to Russia, missing his trial date. This looks suspicious, and it is, but I want to mention that other than being a painter, Adam was a traveling salesman and may have legitimately left Finland for business purposes. By the time Adam traveled back to Finland, which I don't know why he would do that, there had been another serious child rape case in Helsinki, which I will detail shortly. Adam was arrested and questioned once again, but he denied being guilty of this case as well. He was released again, but was warned that he'd be imprisoned if he didn't honor his court date this time. Adam Granlund's harassment charges went to court in the fall of 1910. He confessed that he had indeed been harassing girls in order to fulfill his unnatural desires, but begged for a lenient sentence as he had never actually hurt anyone. Understandably, the prosecutor and the children's parents demanded a harsh sentence. Granlund was sentenced to 5 months in prison. He served his sentence in full and was eventually released. Adam sounds like a very good candidate for Hjördis' murder, considering that there was evidence of him trying to rape her just a day before. He undoubtedly knew Hjördis by looks and knew where she lived. I don't know how he was ruled out in the end, perhaps by his family giving him an alibi. It does seem that Granlund was not responsible for Hjördis' death, as crazy as that sounds. She knew to steer clear of him. What an incredible coincidence it was that just a day before her death, Hjördis ran into another child predator, yet one who was not guilty of her murder. Adam Granlund died 15 years later at the age of 66, to my knowledge never being sentenced for such crimes again. Now, with how many predators were roaming the streets of Helsinki, you won't be surprised to hear that only months later there was another, very similar attack to what happened to Hjördis Lindgren. On the 25th of August, 1910, 4-year-old Anna-Liisa was playing outside of her home on Erikinkatu 14 with her 2 brothers. The children's mother had been at work and started preparing food right after coming home. Anna and her siblings were allowed to stay outside and play until 7 p.m., but Anna asked her mom if she could stay out for longer. When she got permission to do so, she ventured back into the yard. While playing there with one of her neighbors, a man approached them. He was wearing a working man's clothes, a sweater, dot-patterned pants, and a green cap. The man, speaking Finnish, started offering Anna candy if she agreed to follow him. Anna hesitated, but agreed to leave with him. When the man sensed that she wasn't sure after all, he grabbed her hand and aggressively pulled her with him, while Anna started crying. Anna's friend hurriedly returned home, telling her family what had happened. It didn't take long for Anna's mom to start wondering where her daughter had gone. The food was ready, and the others were already eating. Anna wasn't out in the yard, so she decided to quickly check some nearby parks, such as Lapinlahden puisto, where she thought Anna might have gone. Only when she came back empty-handed, she heard from her neighbors what had happened. Anna's mom immediately went to report the incident to the police. Anna's parents and many others searched for the whole night, but couldn't find any trace of her. Undoubtedly, they feared the worst, with Hjördis Lindgren's murder fresh in their minds. The next morning, on the 26th of August, Anna-Liisa was found. Miraculously, she was still clinging to life, fighting off a high fever, and was immediately delivered to Maria Hospital. Poor Anna had been taken a 45-minute walk away from her home to northern Helsinki, an area called Eläintarha. Anna-Liisa had been brutally raped and left to freeze into the woods alone. While August is still considered a summer month, the lowest temperature recorded in Helsinki that month was only around 5 degrees Celsius, or 41 Fahrenheit, far too cold for a little girl. Anna's condition was extremely unstable, and she was not expected to survive. Nonetheless, her parents were thankful that she was found and prayed for her survival while she recovered in the hospital. Newspapers covered the story, and police started immediately searching for the culprit. They publicly called for witnesses to come forward, especially ones that had seen a man with Anna at 8 to 10 p.m. on the 25th. The man had taken Anna towards the main street, so the police were hopeful that someone had seen her. Based on the description they got from Anna's neighbor, they started narrowing down suspects. Thankfully, by the 30th, Anna-Liisa's fever was lowering, which meant that her condition was no longer life-threatening. However, she was still too weak to identify her attacker from the list of suspects the police had curated, so they had to rely on other methods of investigation. The police were getting a lot of tips from people who were convinced they had seen Anna and her attacker. Unfortunately, the description they were working off of was quite vague, and the witness statements seemed to confuse these details as well, which made identifying the suspect very difficult. But, as you may expect, a man like this doesn't simply stop. He's bound to strike again. And he did. A few weeks later, on the 18th of September, a 10-year-old girl, let's call her Jenny, was walking alone in Helsinki. At around 7 p.m., a strange man started following her and trying to get her to come with him to Eläintarha. When she refused his advances time and again, he finally grabbed her and started carrying her with him. Jenny started screaming and resisting with all her strength, which is when the man was forced to let her go. The abduction attempt was seen by 2 other girls of the same age. All 3 fled towards the nearby Hakaniemi market square, where they encountered a mounted constable called Juho Koskinen. They told him what had just happened, which is when he quickly started searching for the culprit around the area. Luckily, the man was still lurking nearby on Hämeenkatu Street, and Constable Koskinen identified him based on the details the girl had just given him. When the suspect realized that he had been caught, he started running and was able to jump into a moving tram traveling towards Lapinlahti. Constable Koskinen started chasing the tram on his horse. When he reached the tram, he was able to signal to the tram operator to stop the vehicle. Constable Koskinen delivered the man to Sörnäinen police station, and the 3 girls were asked to come in as witnesses. The suspect was identified as 45-year-old Erik Davidsson Huhti. Erik was born in 1865 in Asikkala, around 2 hours north of Helsinki. He had 8 siblings, and his father died when he was only 12 years old. This meant that he must have had a difficult and poor childhood. At 19 years old, he moved to Helsinki, and in 1894, when he was 29, he married Edla Matilda Andersson. By 1910, they had been married for 16 years. The newspapers described the Davidssons as a childless couple because their only child had died as a 1-month-old. Edla also had a daughter from a previous relationship, Anna-Maria, born just a year before their marriage in 1893. Anna had died years earlier at the age of 10, leaving Erik and Edla living by themselves on Merimiehenkatu 26. Erik worked as a bricklayer for a beer factory in Sörnäinen. He also had no prior criminal record. In the interrogations, Erik denied having anything to do with the attack on Jenny, which he was arrested for. As there were similarities between this crime and Anna-Liisa's rape weeks earlier, notably the area in which both happened, he was also interviewed about that. Unsurprisingly, he firmly denied this as well, seeming confused and agitated during his stay at the police station. Because the authorities struggled getting any information directly from him, they started interviewing people who knew Erik. Both his wife Edla and his brother Karle told that Erik had been a drunkard for as long as they could remember. When he was drunk, he'd begin womanizing and became quite aggressive. The Davidsons' neighbor, Anna Henrika Blomqvist, also had pretty nasty things to say about him. According to Anna, Erik physically abused his wife, which she had witnessed on multiple occasions. On top of this, not only was he a womanizer, but he had a history of harassing little girls as well. Another witness, who heard about Erik Davidson's arrest, called Olga Heikkilä, came forward. Olga stated that when she was a young girl, Erik harassed her and held her inappropriately. A bricklayer called V.R. Koskinen, who worked with Erik, told the police that he had known the man for 10 years. Koskinen said that while Erik was docile and calm while sober, he became short-tempered after drinking. He also corroborated other witnesses' statements about Erik being a womanizer. Erik himself denied being a drunkard, but said that he had been drinking on 3 days previous to the attack. He confessed to having spent one of those nights with a disreputable woman in Sörnäinen. On the 25th, which was when Anna-Liisa was taken, Erik said that he was working with his colleague until 6 p.m., after which they went out to drink at a pub on Yrjönkatu. They left the bar at around 6:40 p.m. and went their separate ways. Koskinen, Erik's co-worker, corroborated this story. After speaking with a driver for some time, Erik claims to have returned straight home. It was becoming clearer and clearer that Erik was the man they were looking for. The first step was to, of course, ask Anna-Liisa. Erik was shown to her when she felt well enough to see him. The poor girl, still recovering at the hospital, recognized him immediately as her attacker. So did her 6-year-old friend who witnessed the abduction. A huge number of other witnesses from around the city reported not only seeing a man with a little girl on the night of the attack, but many of them actually knew Erik and were able to name him directly. Just to name a few, he was seen by shop clerk Erika Råberg, worker's wife Birgitta Lehtinen, tram operator K.M. Hellström, as well as a printing press worker called Oskar Kaukonen. Oskar's witness statement turned out to be especially significant. Oskar, who was walking on the main street, saw how a middle-aged man was dragging a crying little girl with him. He was alarmed by what he saw and pointed them out to a nearby mounted police officer. The officer, whose name was Kalle Syrjänen, started following the pair to see if everything was all right. The authorities questioned the aforementioned police officer, who admitted that Oskar's statements were true and that he had indeed started following Erik and Anna. Unfortunately, for an unexplained reason, he stopped following them at around 7:45 p.m. when they reached Mäntymäentie, a smaller street which the pair turned to from the main road. Perhaps Anna wasn't crying anymore, and the officer assumed that it had just been a domestic incident between a father and a daughter. Who knows? Tragically, where Kalle Syrjänen turned back and stopped following them was only 5 minutes away from where Anna was later found. If only he had kept going, he likely could have prevented the attack. Now that the investigators had what they were looking for, they sent the case to trial. The court case against Erik Davidsson for the rape and abduction of Anna-Liisa, as well as the abduction attempt on Jenny, was started on 11th of October 1910. At the start of the trial, Anna-Liisa was not well enough to attend, so the court heard other witnesses instead. By the session being held on 22nd of November, Anna-Liisa had physically recovered enough to attend the trial. Erik Davidsson's beard was shaved and he was allowed to wear his own clothes instead of the prisoner's uniform, so that Anna-Liisa had a better chance of repeating her identification, which she was indeed able to do again. Based on this and all the witness testimonies, Erik Davidsson was found guilty of the charges levied against him at the start of 1911. He received an 8-year prison sentence. After hearing this, Erik became so irate that he had to be removed from the courtroom. So, what we're probably all wondering is, was Erik Davidsson guilty of Hjördis Lindgren's murder? There are some significant details that do point to that possibility. 1. Anna and Hjördis were of similar age, 4 and 5 respectively. 2. They lived within a few blocks of each other. 3. They were both taken while they were playing outside after 7 p.m. And 4. Both attacks happened within 6 months of each other. Now, what could point to someone else being guilty? First, no witness ever came forward claiming to have seen Erik with Hjördis. Secondly, Anna didn't die as a result of the attack. She was close, sure, but not because Erik tried to kill her. Hjördis was deliberately murdered by drowning. And third, Erik didn't seem to visit southern Helsinki that much. His 2 known attacks happened in northern Helsinki. At the end of the day, while he was heavily suspected of it, Erik was not convicted or found guilty of the murder. Erik Davidsson Huhti died on the 26th of March 1940. He was 74 years old. His wife Edla did not remarry and died 10 years later. After Hjördis Lindgren's murder, when the media exploded around this case, dozens and dozens of children came forward to explain their encounters with child predators, many of which I've detailed to you in this video. Just within one class, 14 girls identified a single man who often waited at the school gates. Most parks were known to children as not only play areas but hunting grounds for predators. Men would visit all kinds of establishments, such as libraries, movie theaters, and bathrooms, just to find the right opportunity. There was no special type of person who did this either. The criminals were both young and old, Swedish and Finnish speaking, wealthy and poor, with criminal records and without. But thanks to the network of children who had come forward to the police and who by now had grown accustomed to and became familiar with the men roaming the streets, the perpetrators could be arrested. Men from all around the city were hunted down, and among them was a man called Ernst Järvenpää. Ernst was born in Helsinki on 12th of October 1888. Ernst belonged to a large family. He had 7 siblings, and according to his father, he was the least smart and talented of all of them. Ernst attended elementary school, but because of his poor comprehension skills, he fell behind the other students. Some of his cognitive differences have been attributed to a serious illness he suffered as a child. Despite his struggles, he completed school, and when Ernst turned 16, he started earning for himself. By the time of the murder, in March of 1910, he was a young 22-year-old working man who still lived with his family in Sörnäinen. Ernst had become a familiar face to the children of Helsinki. In the past few years, he had started luring children to remote areas, using his familiarity with the city to his advantage. Unlike many of his peers, he was often successful at his new hobby, becoming one of the city's most prolific child predators. By the time he was arrested, he had committed, by his own estimation, up to 25 rapes. Ernst used money and sweets as baits, like many others did, but he noticed that children were hesitant to follow him with only the bait. Even young children understand that this setup is fishy. After all, what is expected of them in return? His new technique was to offer children errands, specifically carrying little packages in exchange for some money. This is, after all, what many poor and working-class kids had to do anyway, doing small jobs around the city. Children had grown trusting of this system, which is precisely what Ernst Järvenpää exploited. This bait worked wonderfully. Time after time, he asked young girls if they could help him carry a packet, and unfortunately, they did. Now, we will return back to the evening of Tuesday, March 15th. 2 13-year-old girls who attended a Swedish school were walking downtown towards Esplanadi. Their names were Elna and, coincidentally, Hjördis. As they arrived on the corner of Mikonkatu and Pohjois-Esplanadinkatu around 7:50 p.m., they saw an adult man walking with a little girl. The unusual pair were approaching from Korkeavuorenkatu, the street that Hjördis Lindgren would have taken to the library and back home. The girl was approximately 5 to 6 years old, had light-colored hair, and she was wearing a dark coat and a black collar. The girl had a hat on as well, but the witnesses couldn't remember what it looked like. This description, of course, is a striking match to Hjördis Lindgren. The man, on the other hand, who looked restless and hurried, was wearing a black jacket and a leather cap. While the girls didn't know his name, they knew him based on his appearance. He had previously tried asking for help in carrying a package and offered a small reward for this task. The girls, old enough to understand his intentions, refused. To their horror, the same kind of package was now in the hands of the small girl who had seemingly fallen for his lure. One of the girls suggested to the other that they should follow the man and his victim, and so they did. After all, there was no doubt about what his intentions were, and maybe they could prevent what was about to happen. They looked on as the pair turned towards Etelä-Esplanadinkatu, eventually arriving at the movie theater La Scala. One of the girls had seen the same man inside La Scala before as well, alone. The man and the girl went in, which is when Elna and Hjördis had to stop following and went home. There was no mistaking it. These schoolgirls were the last ones to have seen poor Hjördis Lindgren alive, other than her killer, of course, who, it now seemed, was Ernst Järvenpää. On the 28th of April, Helsinki Times published the news that police had arrested the 22-year-old. In his interrogations, he was quite willing to admit to successfully raping around 25 girls who he estimated to have been around 7 to 11 years old. His usual hunting grounds were in Kallio, near his home, in eläintarha, like Erik Davidson, and in Töölö, but he denied ever luring children to Kaivopuisto. The one crime Ernst Järvenpää vehemently denied from the beginning was the rape and murder of Hjördis Lindgren. He stated that he'd never seen or talked to the girl in his life. So, what did Ernst say he did on the 15th of March? According to him, he was working a 10-hour shift that day from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. When he was finished, he went home to change his clothes and relax for a little while. After reading some magazines and newspapers, he decided to leave the house again at 6 p.m. Ernst walked over the bridge into the heart of the city until he spotted Aili Aitokoski, a woman he knew, near the Tallberg shop on Main Street. The woman and him were not on speaking terms, so to avoid her, he crossed the street and continued on to Mikonkatu. This was at around 6:30 p.m. He walked through Korkeavuorenkatu to Rickhardinkatu, which is where the National Library is. He did not go inside. After he had passed it, he said he met a young, around 9 to 11-year-old girl with dark hair, who he propositioned to carry his package, as was his usual MO. Unfortunately for him, the girl declined. In the police interview, Ernst admitted that his plan was to lure the girl outside of the city and rape her. When his attempt failed, he decided to visit the movie theater La Scala on Pohjois-Esplanadinkatu 21. Interestingly enough, he couldn't name even one movie from that night's program when asked. After his visit to La Scala, he decided to go home. When he was close to his home in Sörnäinen, he saw one of his acquaintances and went to talk to her. It was Maria Josefina Johansson, who would later testify at his trial. Ernst decided to join Maria on her walk, and they traveled from Porthaninkatu towards Kallio, where Ernst lived. This lasted from around 8:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. While walking, they struck up a conversation, during which Maria said he acted somewhat strangely. When asked, his parents couldn't fully confirm what time their son came home, but he did spend the night there. He slept in the kitchen with one of his younger brothers. Ernst seemingly never explained what his actual purpose was in going into the city that evening. He didn't have any errands, work, appointments, or meetings. He walked to the library, but didn't go inside. He went to the movie theater and watched a film, but couldn't name it or any others from the selection. He met people he knew, but coincidentally. It seems then that his ultimate purpose was to solicit girls, as he admitted to doing, though unsuccessfully. Ernst described his route in a lot of detail. He was a Helsinki native, as he had lived in the city his whole life. He could navigate it easily, remembering specific street names and landmarks. Could it really have been a coincidence that he walked on Korkeavuorenkatu and Rickhardinkatu, right where Hjördis would have been that evening, right at that time? Could it be that Ernst had only modified his story in regards to Hjördis, but kept it truthful otherwise? Maybe the girl he solicited was actually Hjördis herself, but in his story he changed her age, hair color, and the outcome of what had happened, i.e. she didn't come with him, when she actually had. Maybe the two went into La Scala, having been seen on the way by Elna and the other Hjördis, where he sexually assaulted her, which is why he couldn't remember the program. Could this explain why he looked so hurried, restless, and suspicious that evening? But why was he so willing to confess to his other crimes, but not this one? Obviously, the consequences for murder are worse, but why admit anything? I believe what's happening is the phenomenon I've seen called admission of lesser wrongdoing. It involves a criminal confessing to a minor transgression in order to avoid being held fully accountable for a more serious offense. It works because of the false transparency it creates. Why would I admit this if I were hiding that? Ernst Järvenpää's trial started on the 12th of May 1910, only a few weeks after his arrest. At his trial, he admitted once again to being a serial rapist. According to him, though, he didn't view his crimes as wrong, because he had not used any particularly strong violence against any of his victims. At this point, I want to remind the audience that rape is rape, regardless of how it happens. It is an inherently violent act. If there is no consent, it is not normal and it is not sex. Not to mention that we are talking about children here, who are vulnerable, underdeveloped, and cannot give consent. There is no justifiable reason for someone to hurt others like this, let alone children. Now, let's discuss some of the incidents Ernst Järvenpää's victims had come forward with. In October of 1907, a 9-year-old girl was walking down Aleksanderinkatu when Ernst, who was unknown to her at the time, stopped her. First, he asked her to help him carry a package for 10 pence, but when she refused, he raised the reward to 5 marks. She agreed, which is when he led her through Töölö into a patch of woods, where he immediately started attempting to rape her. He held her down by the throat to prevent her from screaming, but she was able to yell for help. He gave up on his plans and she was able to escape. A year later, in either November or December of 1908, a 10-year-old girl had just finished watching a movie in La Scala. Right in the middle of Esplanade, at Johan Runeberg's statue, Ernst Järvenpää approached her. He offered her 3 Finnish marks and some baked goods as a reward if she agreed to carry a package for him, which she did. The two started their journey towards Töölö to pick up the package, and when they arrived at a patch of woods, Ernst threw her onto the snow and threatened to beat her if she screamed. The moment he let go of her, she was able to get up and flee back out of the woods. Only weeks later, in January, Ernst attempted the same thing on the same victim multiple times with no luck. To me, this tells that Ernst did this so often that he probably didn't even remember his victims' faces. Next summer, in 1909, a 10-year-old schoolgirl who was walking on Market Square also ran into Ernst. He offered 3 Finnish marks in exchange for helping him carry a package into a boat. The girl agreed, and the two went to fetch the aforementioned package. The man led the girl into a patch of woods in Töölö, probably the same woods he used all the other times, where he again started opening the girl's clothes. When she started screaming, he let her go and even paid her 15 pence for her tram ride back home. Just a few nights after Hjördis Lindgren's murder, Ernst started talking with a few girls inside La Scala. He asked if one of them could help him carry a package. He'd pay 3 Finnish marks, which would be around 15 euros today, and some caramels as a reward. One of the girls, a 10-year-old, agreed, and the two went on their way. The man lured her to Eläintarha, where, as you may remember, Anna-Lisa was also raped by Erik Davidsson. There, he was able to sexually assault the girl, infecting her with a venereal disease. Unfortunately, this case did not immediately come into the attention of the police. If it had, it may have been connected to Hjördis's case much sooner. The poor girl had to go into hospital treatment. On the 4th of April, only a few weeks before Ernst Järvenpää's arrest, an 11-year-old girl, let's call her Mari, came to the police and said that a man had tried to rape her earlier that day. She was walking with another child through Kaisaniemi into Töölö. In an area called Mäntymäki, the children separated, and Mari continued her journey alone on what is now called Mannerheimintie, the main street in Helsinki. When she reached the old sugar factory on her way home, Mari ran into a man, Ernst Järvenpää. He asked her if she had seen another man carrying a small package, to which she said no. Ernst then asked if Mari knew her way home, and as she hesitated to answer, he offered to walk her there. Not suspecting anything, she agreed and started following him. Ernst led the girl further down Mannerheimintie to a smaller street, and then through a small patch of woods into an isolated area. Here, the man told Mari that he was looking to buy underwear for his own daughter, but didn't know what kind she'd need. This is when he suddenly started to open Mari's clothes and looked at her underwear to get a reference point. Naturally, Mari got scared and she started screaming, which is when Ernst let go of her and she quickly fled home. She immediately told her mother what had happened. Mari's mom checked her daughter and thankfully was able to confirm that she hadn't been raped. The court heard all of these stories, some of them through the victim's own testimony. At least 4 young girls, ranging from 9 to 12, were heard as victims of Ernst Järvenpää. All of them retold the events with consistency and testified that Ernst had used violence, unlike what he claimed. The court deemed it necessary to get Järvenpää psychiatrically evaluated, so they could be sure he was legally liable for his actions. Thus, the court adjourned and sent him to the Lapinlahti Mental Hospital, the first of its kind in Finland. While he was in observation, police were finishing their preliminary investigation report. Ernst Järvenpää stayed at the mental hospital for months. At the end of his stay, senior physician Christian Sibelius, the brother of famed composer Jean Sibelius, gave his statement. Professor Sibelius stated that Ernst Järvenpää did not exhibit any signs of mental illness, psychosis, or a disorder of any kind. He was, however, described as being spiritually lacking. His mind and soul had slow development, and his sexual behaviors were highly disturbed, something which the professor attributed to developmental issues in his brain. Professor Sibelius thus recommended that Ernst Järvenpää would be best suited to be placed in a facility or institution which was equipped to treat him until he was no longer a danger to society. Equipped with this statement, the court continued in February of 1911. Ernst Järvenpää continued denying his guilt in Hjördis's murder. He claimed now that he spent all of the 15th near his home in Kallio. In this court hearing, however, the 2 schoolgirls Elna and Hjördis were brought to testify against him. They explained to the court, as they had to the police, how they witnessed Ernst Järvenpää with a girl who looked exactly like Hjördis Lindgren, carrying a package, being lured to the movie theater. The prosecutor asked for postponement in regards to Hjördis Lindgren's murder, as he wanted to collect more evidence, and thus the court continued onto the subject of the rape Järvenpää had committed in eläintarha, in which he had infected his victim with a venereal disease. The girl had to spend months in the hospital as a result of the attack. Her father demanded 1,500 mark compensation, which would amount to around 7,500 euros today, because he was afraid she would remain defective for the rest of her life. A horrifying way to speak about a child, your own, no less. I'm not sure if he was referring to a physical injury or illness, or if he merely meant that his daughter was now spoiled goods, so to say. Either way, it's devastating to think about how little support these children must have gotten, especially psychologically, after what they'd gone through. Surprisingly, Ernst now denied committing the rape in eläintarha, even though he had freely admitted to it before. He claimed that the police had forced him to confess by pinning him against the wall. On the 23rd of February, Adam Granlund, the man who had solicited Hjördis before and was now in prison, was brought to the courtroom. He was questioned about his involvement in the case, which he continued to deny. Ernst Järvenpää's case was in court for the last time at the start of March 1911. This is when the most crucial testimonies were heard, namely Constables Suomalainen and Wigner, who were patrolling Kaivopuisto on the night of the murder, Maria Johansson, who talked with Järvenpää on the night of the murder, and lastly, the night watchman Olof Maria, who saw the suspicious gentleman approaching him from Kaivopuisto soon after the murder was committed. The constables repeated that they had not seen or heard anything suspicious on their rounds. One of them recapped his meeting with the two men walking their dog, but that was it. Maria Johansson corroborated Järvenpää's story about them talking for around 30 minutes in Sörnäinen. He was alone and, as stated previously, acting suspiciously. The next, and perhaps the most important testimony, was watchman Olof Maria's. Maria went over his witness statement from the night of the murder, explaining what time he heard the screams and when he saw the man on the ice. He explained in great detail what the suspect looked like, undoubtedly making the attendees examine Järvenpää's looks carefully. Maria stated that the man he saw on the night of the murder was not Ernst Järvenpää. This piece of testimony was devastating for the prosecution, because the investigation had always assumed that the man Maria had seen had to have been the killer. If that man was not Järvenpää, then Järvenpää wasn't the killer. Maria actually knew Järvenpää by appearance even before this trial. If he thought who he had seen was Järvenpää, he may have been able to testify so much earlier, so this detail is consistent. While I don't have a photo or description of what Järvenpää looked like, I must say that he doesn't fit Maria's description either. Ernst was a working class man, definitely not a gentleman. Whatever the case may be, both Maria Johansson and Olof Maria's testimonies seem to have been crucial in this case, as Ernst Järvenpää was not found guilty of Hjördis Lindgren's murder. The court decided that there was simply not enough evidence to prosecute him for this case. They did, however, find Järvenpää guilty of at least 4 sexual assaults and at least 1 attempted sexual assault. He was given 8 years in prison and was obliged to pay 600 Finnish marks to the father of the girl he had infected. The court took into account Professor Sibelius's statement and decided that while Järvenpää was defective mentally, he was coherent and responsible for his crimes. Järvenpää was unhappy with the ruling and made a complaint about his sentence. The case was sent to the Court of Appeals for review in March, but it was not changed. In September of 1911, Ernst Järvenpää's 8-year prison sentence was confirmed. With that, he was sent to prison, and Hjördis Lindgren's murder was left unsolved. I saw no further comments in the newspapers about Hjördis Lindgren's murder after the trial, leaving the case forgotten. Ernst Järvenpää died at the age of 79 on 31st of August 1968. He got to see Finland gain independence in 1917 and the subsequent civil war in 1918. He lived through the Prohibition era, he survived and likely participated in the Second World War. He saw the modernization of the city he was born in, how horse-drawn carriages changed to cars, gas lamps became electric, and how old wooden buildings were replaced with new concrete ones. The world in which he lived during the events of the murder had effectively long since died as well. All these changes Hjördis should have been able to see, but she didn't. We can only speculate what kind of life she could have lived. She would have started attending school soon. She would have made friends, graduated, perhaps married and had kids of her own. She could have gone to see the Summer Olympics of 1952 in Helsinki with her own family, or celebrated Armi Kuusela winning the first ever Miss Universe pageant the same year. Hjördis would have only been 64 while watching the moon landing from a television, piece of technology she couldn't even have dreamed of. Hjördis Lindgren's father Johan Lindgren died on the 12th of February 1912, less than 2 years after his only daughter's death. He was 38 years old. I couldn't find out what happened to Hjördis's mom, Fanny. She likely moved away from Helsinki or married someone else. She had lost her small family completely in the span of 2 years and likely never fully recovered from it. Hjördis and her father were both buried at Hietaniemi Cemetery in Helsinki. I contacted their office and they told me their graves can no longer be found. So, what actually happened in this case? Who was responsible for Hjördis Lindgren's murder? I went back and forth on this for a long time, specifically whether or not I thought Ernst Järvenpää was guilty. He was both the media and the authorities' main suspect, and was the only child predator to go to trial for the murder. At first I thought that he may have been innocent, because he somewhat had an alibi in the form of his acquaintance Maria Johansson. On top of that, Ernst doesn't match all of Maria's description of the man he saw coming from Kaivopuisto. Even if the schoolgirls weren't mistaken and they really saw him with Hjördis just before 8 p.m., he would not have had time to commit the murder on the other side of the city and then be seen by his friend in Sörnäinen at 8:30 p.m. Either one of the witness testimonies is incorrect or Ernst didn't commit the murder. Maria Johansson may have had a motive to help her friend, so she covered for him. And the girls may have been looking to get the prize money from the Women's Association. I'm not claiming either of these to be the case, because I simply don't know. But I am inclined to believe the schoolgirls because their testimony aligned with the timeline and the area of the disappearance, as well as everything we know about Ernst Järvenpää. The other thing that made me doubt his guilt was the fact that Hjördis is quite a lot younger than all his other confirmed victims. If he is responsible, she would be an outlier in terms of age. That said, while predators often have a preferred age range, they also operate extremely opportunistically. The bulk of all child victims I came across were around 10 and up, so kids that were a bit older, more independent, already went to school and were much more likely to be outside in the evening. It's not necessary that Ernst Järvenpää or anyone else specifically targeted this age range. It's just that this victim pool was the most abundant. The only other suspect that had a child victim this young was Erik Davidsson, but he did also target older children. Davidsson is overall a good candidate in this case, since he was so aggressive and violent. I can totally see a man like him completely losing control and going too far. His victim Anna-Liisa was also not far from death, but the relatively warm summer weather likely saved her life. Erik lived merely a few blocks away from Hjördis Lindgren, and he seemed to know his way around the city. When it comes to night watchman Olof Maria's testimony, I'm also not sure what to think. Neither Ernst or Erik fit the description. In fact, only Carl Bergman, the gentleman lurking in the bathroom, sort of fits the bill here. I don't consider him a serious suspect because I have no other evidence to link him to Hjördis, but if he were guilty, he's the kind of guy who would get away with it. The whole case seemed to have been built around the fact that Maria saw the killer that night, which is flawed because we don't actually know if that's true. The gentleman could have been a random passerby who was incorrectly profiled as the killer, and all suspects were then compared to his description with no results. The last thing I think is worth considering here is that Ernst Järvenpää may have been developmentally delayed in a way where he genuinely didn't understand what he did was wrong. Multiple people from his family to his school to the doctors alluded to this. He himself claimed in court that he didn't think he did anything wrong, which may be why he was so willing to confess to everything. In some twisted way, he may have viewed the girls as consenting because they agreed to follow him. Perhaps he thought of them as peers intellectually, because he himself was delayed. What also made me consider this is him alleging that the police had used violence against him in order to get a confession. He's not a reliable witness to this, of course, but it did make me think of other cases where young, sometimes disabled or easily manipulated men have been coerced to confess. Regardless of if Ernst is guilty, I think it's completely plausible that authorities used violence. Keeping all of this in mind, I still think that from all the suspects we know, Ernst Järvenpää makes the most sense. His MO and track record, his changing story, his lack of alibi for the night, as well as the girls' witness statement, all leads me to that conclusion. Ernst was familiar with the city. He was resourceful. He was young. He wasn't a child that long ago himself, which meant that perhaps he knew how to talk and relate to children, and how to take advantage of the errand system that a lot of children had to utilize. My official timeline looks something like this. On the 15th of March, at around 6 p.m., Hjördis gets permission from her mom to go visit the library. She walks outside, where she soon runs into some boys playing, and thinking she'll have plenty of time, she decides to join their game. At around 7, the children separate, which happens only a few hundred meters away from Hjördis' home. A little while later, around 7:30 p.m., her neighbor Wiberg sees Hjördis leaning on the gutter, and the two talk for a little while. After this interaction is finished, Hjördis heads to the library. Perhaps she even made it in and got through one book just like she promised. Now, when she leaves the library, she runs into a friendly-looking young man. He has a little package in his hands and asks her if she'd be willing to help him carry it for 3 marks. She agrees. Perhaps the treats she could buy with all that money flash before her eyes. Or maybe she imagines how happy her mom would be that she was such a big and independent girl now. Ernst hands her the package, and the two start their journey. At 7:50 p.m., the pair arrives at Esplanadi, where the two schoolgirls, Elna and Hjördis, see them. Ernst nervously walks Hjördis to one of his favorite places, movie theater La Scala. This is where my theory becomes hazier, because we have no confession, nor are there any further eyewitness accounts. I think that there are a few possibilities for what may have happened next. The first is that Ernst takes Hjördis to a toilet facility in the theater, which is where he rapes her. Next, he uses a sink or toilet bowl to drown her, so she won't scream and get him caught. To my knowledge, the water in her lungs was not tested, so we don't know whether it was ocean water or pipe water. Next, he hides her body, though I don't know how, and then exits the theater to gain an alibi. He somewhat succeeds at this by running into his acquaintance Maria. Maria notices how weird and jittery he is, but the two talk for half an hour. After this, Ernst is not accounted for, so I can assume that he returns back to the theater and is able to move her body to Kaivopuisto. My problem with this theory is mostly that it would have been very hard for him to move her, dead or alive, to where she was found. If he had already raped her, she'd undoubtedly be crying and not willing to follow him, which would have caused a commotion. And if she was dead, how did he hide her body and transport her? A variation of this theory I considered is that Ernst left Hjördis to watch a film while he went to scope out where he'd commit his crime, or again to gain an alibi for himself. This way, when he returned, she'd still be in good spirits. Hjördis would feel warm and rested after sitting in the theater, ready to walk further. This theory seems likelier, but it's risky in the sense that Hjördis could have easily left the theater while he was gone, and then he would have lost the fare he paid for the ticket and had to find another victim. But the strength of the theory is that it allows for all the witness statements to be true, and for the visit to the theater to make sense. Why would Ernst have led her there unless it served a purpose? This theory also aligns with the timeline of Olof Maria. Ernst and Hjördis would have arrived at the scene of the crime around 10 to 11 p.m., making it possible for the screams Maria heard to have come from Hjördis. It's good to note that the theater ran movies up until 11 p.m. every night. The last theory is that the two simply left the package at the theater and Ernst walked Hjördis straight to Kaivopuisto. This theory can only make sense if Ernst Järvenpää's friend lied to cover for him. I don't see why she would, but we can never know. Ernst and Hjördis may have walked through the park itself, where the only witness to claim to have seen them was one of the predators who used the park as a hunting ground and was lurking in the crevice. They may have also walked another route, such as the eastern shore, skipping the park entirely. Regardless of how they made it there, this is where Ernst sexually abused Hjördis and dunked her head in the sea to silence her. While he had not drowned anyone before that we know of, He had suffocated and choked some of his other victims. Perhaps Hjördis was very loud, or she fought back, or she threatened to tell someone. Perhaps Ernst didn't mean to go that far, but lost control. Whatever the case, he killed her. It seems that Ernst then dragged her body further away to hide it, and her hat came off. He may have smoked some cigarettes to calm his nerves, and then returned home. While Ernst Järvenpää didn't get an official conviction for the murder, I am at least satisfied knowing that he went to prison for something. It's more than I can say for many other unsolved crimes. Perhaps the streets of Helsinki were a little bit safer during those 8 years. I think this case is interesting in the sense that nothing quite like it could happen today. Children this young are rarely out by themselves, at night no less. In the Western world, children, despite being poor, don't really run errands to earn money. Most kids and their parents are aware of stranger danger. Even if a murder like this happened, it could be solved through DNA evidence from the crime scene or with security cameras or cell phone data. It seems that the police did try everything they could in this case, but it just wasn't enough. There are a lot of questions left unanswered here, like, how are there so few eyewitnesses? Why didn't the killer push her body all the way into the water? Why did this assault escalate to murder when others seemingly didn't? Why didn't police try to solve the murder after Ernst Järvenpää was found not guilty? I doubt that 116 years on we'll ever find the answers to any of these questions. Lastly, if I must find a silver lining here, I suppose Hjördis's case helped save a lot of other children from child predation and even murder. Perhaps we can remember her as a kind of patron saint of children. She was a sweet child, trusting and brave. Wherever she is now, I hope she's at peace, playing and reading picture books.